In 1966, a piece of history was carried through the doors of the Pentagon building in Washington, D.C. Joining the politicians and military officials that walked the halls, a team of scientists and engineers just back from Greenland brought 2 frosty cylinders of ice to present to the world. The ice was clear and stood just half a foot tall and 4 inches wide, perched on the lid of a plastic cooler. It was hundreds, maybe even thousands of years old. No one knew for sure yet. Geologist Chester Langway and the other men stood in front of a curtain, ready for their performance. They held these cylinders of ice up in front of the army brass and, of course, the press. A new sound filled the quiet room. The ice was chopped into small, glittering pieces. Then, the men dropped the shattered pieces of ancient ice into modern Coca-Cola. The ice started to melt and mix with the cola. Air that had been trapped in the ice for thousands of years escaped into the windowless room with a snap, crackle, and pop. As the ancient air bubbles popped and fizzed in the dark brown soda, waiters passed the cups. According to a New York Times article written about the day, quote, "The Coca-Cola drink tasted like Coca-Cola, and the ice, taken from the 1,800-foot level and said to have been formed around the time Christ was born, tasted like ice." The New York Times article gives us a glimpse into that day. Beyond those few paragraphs, the details of the day are lost. Did someone make a toast? Did anyone taste the history that was mixed with their drink? Or the diesel fuel that bathed the ice as it came to the surface? What a perfect all-American finish to a story that began 3,000 miles away, in Greenland, during World War II. Hello, and welcome to Frozen History, a podcast that tells the incredible story of Camp Century, from tensions of the Cold War to scientists in freezers, all the way to the future of our own planet. I'm your host, Mary Kueser, and I'm excited to bring you on a journey of exploration, history, science, and secrets held within the ice. You are listening to Episode 1. The island of Greenland sits in the North Atlantic Ocean. Much of the island is above the Arctic Circle, and the rugged, mountainous coastline and barren ice sheet are not the most welcoming landscapes. With a population of just over 56,000 people, half of which live in the capital city Nuuk, much of the island is uninhabited. And in the winter, it is cold. Very cold. The cold has been a mystery to humans for as long as we've been around. Stories of people striding out towards our most northern lands span back millennia. In Greenland, the first people arrived between 4,000 and 5,000 years ago. They crossed the frozen sea from Canada, ending up in an area called Bidefik, which would later be called Thule. After them, more waves of immigrants arrive, the last of which remain on Greenland today. Then came the Norse in the early 900s, and the first expeditions from England in the 1500s. Those expeditions gave way to more, and more after that. In 1892, an American explorer, Robert Peary, broke his leg and spent months in recovery at Thule, the same spot the first Greenlanders came upon when they arrived. Later, Peary made his way across the Greenland ice sheet and came back alive. Then, in 1909, Robert Peary and Matthew Henson set out on an expedition to reach the North Pole. After several failed attempts, the men pushed northwards with extraordinary courage and drive.
The main party, under my command, 6 men, 5 sledges, 40 dogs, pushed forward by forced marches to the pole itself.
On April 6th, Henson became the first person to reach the North Pole, reportedly arriving mere hours before Peary. As a black man, Henson received far less recognition for his role in Arctic exploration. But from his success, the evidence was clear. The cold Arctic was indeed survivable, if barely.
The discovery of the North Pole on the 6th of April 1909 by the last expedition of the Peary Arctic Club means that the splendid frozen jewel of the North, for which through centuries men of every nation have struggled and suffered and died, is won at last and is to be worn forever by the stars and stripes.
Humans, as a species, have a tendency to push limits, push forward, push themselves. This attribute makes itself evident whenever Arctic exploration is brought up. Peary and Henson were far from the last to throw their hats into the metaphorical Arctic Circle. In 1930, 3 German men spent a winter camped under the ice of Greenland. Their camp was called Eismitt. Located at 10,000 feet of elevation, Eismitt was close to the highest point of the ice sheet. The temperatures outside of their snow cave were frigid, plummeting to lower than negative 80 degrees Fahrenheit below zero. Inside, they found shelter from the biting winds and whipping snow. One of the men was Fritz Luva. On a blustery journey from the west coast of Greenland to Eismitt, his toes froze. His companions, Ernst Zorga and Johann Georgi, had to cut off Luva's toes one by one with a pocket knife. I can't imagine the cold acted as much of an anesthesia, but nevertheless, Luva survived. In fact, all 3 of the men lived to tell the tale of their winter under the ice. They were part of a scientific expedition led by Alfred Wegener, working to study the weather and measure the depth of the ice sheet using seismic waves. Yes, you heard that right. They blew up explosives on the ice sheet to see how deep the ice was. And it worked. For the first time, they knew that the ice sheet under their camp was about 6,500 feet deep. And the work didn't stop there. Ernst Zorga spent his winter digging a slanted shaft into the snow and ice below the camp. As the months passed, the depths and character of the frozen water revealed themselves to Zorga. He took measurements of temperature, snow density, and layering. The layering was key. Zorga found that the snow that fell in the winter months was much denser than the snow that fell in the summer months. He envisioned the snow as a layered account of Earth's history. This new perspective completely changed the way that glaciologists looked at their snow and ice, and essentially launched the field of ice core science. Alfred Wegener was a significant figure in the scientific community, and this expedition only expanded that reputation. Unfortunately, he didn't fare so well as some of his team members. While the men under the ice survived, Wegener and his partner had struck out across the surface of the ice. In November, with only a few hours of daylight at temperatures well below zero. Neither man was seen alive again. The evidence was clear. Living under the ice provided essential protection from the wind and the snow. It wasn't until decades later that the U.S. military would turn their attention to Greenland, and the acts of science and survival conducted by Wegener's team would be taken to an entirely new level. American interest in Greenland didn't really begin until World War II. It was the Allies versus the Axis. With German U-boats prowling the North Atlantic, the U.S. military realized that getting planes from North America to Europe was risky. There was no way the planes could just be shipped. The waters of the Atlantic were just too dangerous. The answer was clear. The planes would have to fly. But how? In 1941, even the largest planes had trouble flying from the US to Europe without refueling. That is where Greenland comes in. Denmark's colonization of Greenland began in 1721, so by the time the US became interested in Greenland, they had to go to Denmark and ask permission. In April of 1941, Denmark said yes. The US began building military bases on Greenland within weeks. Other bases were hastily built to the west in Labrador and to the east in Iceland. In just a few months, the US military created a chain of airfields where planes could refuel on their way to fight the Axis powers. It was about 900 miles from one airbase to the next. Planes could fly that far on one fueling, but they couldn't go much further. The plan was well thought out, but even the best of plans were no match for the strength of nature. Greenland's fog hung thick, and without radar, the pilots were flying nearly blind. Often, their only options were dead reckoning and celestial navigation. When faced with the decision, a fog-shrouded approach up a misty fjord surrounded by 1,000-foot rock cliffs was simply a no-go. An emergency landing on the ice sheet was the lesser of two evils. Plane after plane succumbed to the wind, snow, fog, and low clouds that Greenland threw at them. Rescue was imperative, risky, and sometimes the downed planes couldn't even be located.
Below are the barren wastes of Greenland. Here, where the temperature is 40 below zero, is the setting of one of the most difficult rescue operations in naval and air force history.
But the Army Air Corps was not going to leave its men to die on the ice. They built rescue stations, and soon realized that seaplanes could land and even take off from the surface of the ice sheet. This was a game changer. With severely limited weather and navigational resources, the harsh reality of the island became clear. In order for Greenland to be a useful asset, the military needed to get up close and personal with the ice. In 1951, Operation Blue Jay led to the building of an air base and naval station at Thule, close to where Perry and the first Greenlanders landed.
In 104 days, they had built a giant runway capable of serving our heaviest bombers. Dozens of barracks had sprouted from Thule's frozen soil. Blue Jay was operational.
Built on the rocky shores of the island, this base brought a military presence to Greenland that included planes, radar stations, 10,000 soldiers and scientists, and even nuclear weapons. It also allowed for a higher volume of supplies and materials to make their way to the ice sheet. Having conquered the frozen land, now the military headed onto the ice and built 2 sub-ice camps, each housing 16 men and a radar station for tracking Russian planes and missiles. In 1953, Site 1 was constructed 120 miles north of Thule. Site 2 was built about 240 miles away towards the center of the Greenland ice sheet. These bases were the military's first real experiments in living under the ice.
Here, a hardy group of airmen beat the weather by living literally under it in a unique housing facility. Their complete living quarters are contained in metal cylinders interconnected by passageways. Originally placed on the surface, in 2 years, they have sunk into the relative warmth of the Arctic snow. Diesel generators supply electrical power needs. The fuel also warms quarters to an even 72 degrees.
The military learned a lot about living with the ice during their time at these bases. They measured the warping of the metal tubes as the snow pressed down on them. Their cakes were flat and their bread wouldn't rise, so they tested and changed their recipes to adapt to the environmental differences of the Arctic. And they realized that to prevent their drinking water from tasting like diesel fuel, their power would have to come from somewhere else. In 1959, construction started on the base that would serve as a culmination of the sub-ice habitation experiments. As men began to arrive and prepare for the long, cold months of construction ahead, Camp Century was born.
On the top of the world, below the surface of a giant ice cap, a city is buried. Today on the island of Greenland, as part of man's continuing efforts to master the secrets of survival in the Arctic, the United States Army has established an unprecedented nuclear-powered Arctic Research Center.
When I first heard about Camp Century, I was a bit baffled. To be fair, the idea of a city dug into the ice sounds like some wild invention, like something you'd see in a comic book. And in fact, the camp was actually featured in several comic books, one even in French. The reality, though, was not nearly as romantic. Unlike Sites 1 and 2, the plan for Century was to dig trenches into the ice and cover them with roofs of compacted snow. The tunnels branched out from a 1,000-foot-long frigid boulevard called Main Street. But building a city isn't an easy task. Building one out of ice and snow is an incredible feat. Fortunately, Camp Century didn't go it alone. To make this possible, they had an extensive support system off the ice. Men and materials all came through the base at Thule. Thule was about 150 miles west of Camp Century and served as the first stop in North Greenland for anything headed for the city under the ice. Camp Tuto, a smaller post 14 miles south of Thule, also allowed access to Camp Century via the Ice Road, a 138-mile trail across the ice sheet. You didn't drive a car to Century. You took a swing. Swings were like snow trains without a track. A massive tractor pulled a set of wagons along the icy, snowy path. The wagons had sleds or massive inflated wheels adapted to travel across the ice sheet.
We call these convoys of 10 and 20-ton sleds heavy swings. Crawling up the ice cap at approximately 2 miles an hour, a heavy swing would reach the camp in about 70 hours if everything went well.
The Army engineers built a massive gravel ramp up the steep ice sheet edge, which allowed the swings to climb onto the ice sheet. But that was only the beginning of the journey. Now, ice may seem like a solid mass, and in some ways it is, but over time the ice shifts. Fissures open up, Cracks form, pieces break, and the dangers are often hidden beneath the snow. The hidden dangers under the snow could mean trouble for travelers. The threats of the crevasses were real. On top of that, the wind, fog, and snow created whiteout conditions that brought swings to a halt until visibility was restored. Throughout the entire journey, the driver's eyes were peeled. In an attempt to minimize the risk, the swings followed flags placed on the ice and snow by the expeditions before them. These flags marked safe passage and signaled drivers in the right direction. The swing only stopped for drivers to change shifts. Meals were served in the dining wanigan, and men slept in bunks stacked 4 high in the sleeper wanigan as they bounced across the surface of the ice. Advancing slowly and steadily, the swing eventually came upon Camp Century and slid to a stop. For a newbie, seeing the camp for the first time must have been quite a sight to behold. The surface of the ice looked regular enough, with some flags, a few people, and perhaps a snowplow or two on a background of endless white. But get closer, and you would find the tunnel entrances. One iconic photograph, shown time and time again, features the entrance to a tunnel sloping down into the ice. The tunnels had to be large enough to allow huge D8 tractors, snowcats, and weasels to enter, and the pitch-black, gaping opening makes you wonder what else could be down there, just beneath the blinding snowy plains. As it turns out, those tunnels held quite a lot. Camp Century had everything the men stationed there needed.
Here there are showers for all and facilities for every modern convenience. It also has a small chapel for regular religious services. The modern spacious kitchens provide a well-balanced and appetizing menu. Except for the fact that they have no windows, the men of Camp Century live exactly as do other soldiers.
There was even a bar where the enlisted men could get a 3.2% beer any time of the day. There were no women, no trees, and 1 camp dog. These niceties, however, weren't present at the beginning of camp construction. Instead, the men who arrived early on in the days of Camp Century found themselves in canvas tents called Jamesways on the surface of the ice sheet. They were heated by oil stoves, but showers were scarce. Construction began in 1959.
Peter snow plows imported from Switzerland chewed their way into the ice cap. Roofs were constructed of overlapping steel arches. These were then covered with snow. Because the snow plows milled the snow, it soon froze into a cement-hard surface. Buildings were prefabricated in the United States and came complete down to the last nail. There was no sending out to a local hardware store if a hinge were missing.
By the time the majority of the troops got to the camp, the tunnels were built and the buildings installed, providing protection from the wind and weather above. The question is, why put 200 men under the ice? To unpack why this camp ended up where, when, and how it was, we need to take a step back and consider the world beyond the ice.
As the world progressively divides itself into 2 camps, the free and the communist-dominated, the northernmost part of the globe becomes increasingly important, for the shortest route from one camp to the other lies across the pole. Today, Greenland, Canada, and Alaska form a geographic cordon of security, guarding the Western Hemisphere against the possibility of aggression across the top of the world.
One of the original purposes of the base at Thule was defense. Thule was part of the Ballistic Missile Early Warning System, a line of bases equipped to detect any missile movement. A report in Life magazine stated, if one were based in Boston, it could find and follow the flight of an orange thrown in Miami. Clearly, NATO was nervous. Thule was also equipped with nuclear missiles placed in large silos, just in case. But something else was in Greenland, a whisper of adventure. Sure, by successfully building a base and living on the ice, the US could show some of that American superiority they were always trying to prove. But to show domination over nature would be another level entirely. And so there it was. Camp Century. The tunnels had been built, the men shipped in, the supplies all ready, the nuclear reactor in place. Oh, did I forget to mention that? In 1960, the world's first portable nuclear reactor was brought to Century. The reactor traveled by boat to the island, and made its way across the snow and ice in the same swings used to transport men and supplies. After arriving on site, it took over 8 weeks for the reactor to be fully assembled. And even then, it wasn't ready to power the camp. By 1961, after months of trial and failure, it was up and running, providing heat, power, and water to the soldiers there.
The power plant consisted of 4 basic elements: a nuclear heat source, equipment that would convert the heat energy into electrical energy, and a system to dispose of excess heat, all regulated by an extensive network of instruments and controls.
By the 9th hour, the last fuel element had gone into place.
Now here it is. With all 5 control rods withdrawn 6.24 inches, PM 2A, when critical at 0652 hours.
Now we have the men, the supplies, and a nuclear reactor with 44 pounds of uranium all packed into the icy tunnels. So what next? Well, according to the US military, science was next. Soon after the construction of the camp, scientists began working on drilling a hole through a mile of ice. Slowly, they drilled deeper and deeper. The men were making history, and the secrets contained in the deepest, most ancient ice were making their way to the surface again, one piece of ice core at a time. Nearly 6 years later, close to Independence Day 1966, a 6-inch wide hole extended 4,550 feet from the floor of the camp into the frozen sediment below. 2 months later, Chester Langway and that ice were in Washington, D.C., presenting the successes of the camp to the military and the press. The show they put on was flashy, and maybe a little bit outlandish, serving ancient ice and Coca-Cola to those higher-ups. But that visit to the Pentagon was not the last press coverage Camp Century would get, and it wasn't the first either. Stay tuned for the next episode of Frozen History, where we dive into the Arctic that was painted by the media, and the truth behind the tales. This episode was researched, written, and produced by me, Mary Kueser, with extensive help from Paul Bierman and the Camp Century team at the University of Vermont. If you'd like more information, including links to the extensive research the team did and published, head on over to our website at campcentury.org and find us on Instagram at campcentury.fossilsundeриce. For an even deeper dive into the story of Camp Century, its science, and people, check out the book When the Ice is Gone, published by W.W. Norton. This material is based upon work supported by the U.S. National Science Foundation under award number OPP 2114629 and EAR 1735676 and 2300560. As always, thank you for listening, and we will see you next episode.